The Appalachian Mountains rose like silent guardians over the Cherokee village, their slopes covered by a golden blanket of autumn leaves that danced in the cold October wind. Selu walked along the winding trail that led to the creek, carrying the wicker basket woven by her grandmother, her bare feet stepping softly on the fallen leaves that crackled like ancestral whispers. At 19, she possessed the natural grace of her lineage, with hair black as night that fell in waves over her shoulders and dark eyes that reflected the quiet wisdom of the women of her clan. The deerskin dress, adorned with blue and red beads in traditional geometric patterns, embraced her slender body as she moved with the fluidity of one born in harmony with the earth. Her mother, Galilahi, had embroidered each bead with whispered prayers, hoping her daughter would find a good husband among the young warriors of the village. The sound of hooves against stones interrupted the morning tranquility, making Selu raise her eyes toward the main trail. A man on horseback emerged from the mist that still clung to the valleys, his silhouette standing out against the gray sky like an apparition from another world. He was not Cherokee. This was clear from his sunburned fair skin, the brown hair that fell disheveled over his forehead, and the coarse wool clothing that betrayed his origin among the white settlers who had established themselves in neighboring lands. Selu felt her heart quicken, not from fear but from a strange curiosity that made her remain motionless like a deer that spots the hunter. The man dismounted with careful movements, his leather boots touching the ground with respect, as if he knew he was stepping on sacred land. His blue eyes met hers across the distance, and in that moment, something invisible moved between them like a current in the air. The stranger approached slowly, his hands open in a universal gesture of peace, and Selu noticed that he carried in his features a gentleness that contrasted with the haunting stories the elders told about white men. He stopped at a respectful distance, inclining his head slightly in a greeting that demonstrated knowledge of local customs, and murmured a few words in Cherokee with a heavy but sincere accent. Selu understood that he was asking for water for his horse and pointed silently toward the creek, watching as he followed her indication with measured steps. When he knelt at the edge of the crystal-clear water, allowing his horse to drink, Selu noticed the scar that ran across his right hand and the marks of hard work etched in his calloused palms. There was a story in those hands, a journey of hardships that awakened in her an inexplicable compassion. In the days that followed, the man, who had introduced himself as James through gestures and broken words, returned at the same time, always respectful, always patient. Selu discovered that he had established a small cabin in the lands beyond the tribal frontier, working as an itinerant blacksmith and honest trader who had never tried to deceive the Cherokee in his exchanges. He learned words in her language with the dedication of a child, and she, in turn, began to understand some expressions in English that he whispered like prayers. The encounters became silent rituals. She brought fresh water in gourds. He offered small metal objects forged by his own hands, a delicate bracelet, a polished mirror, a small bell that chimed like children's laughter. Each exchange was accompanied by looks that said more than words could express, and Selu felt growing in her chest a dangerous feeling she knew she could not name. The village began to murmur when Selu's encounters with the stranger became known, the older women shaking their heads with disapproval while weaving baskets or preparing hides. Wesa, the young warrior who had long courted Selu with the approval of both families, watched with growing unease his intended's steps toward the creek, his fists clenching like stones when he noticed the different gleam in her eyes upon returning. Galilahi tried to talk with her daughter about the dangers of getting involved with a man from another world, reminding her of the tragic stories of women who had lost themselves by following strangers. But Selu only lowered her eyes and continued her tasks in silence. Love had settled in her heart like a seed germinating in forbidden soil, growing each day with a force that neither she herself could understand or control. Winter came early that year, bringing with it cutting winds that made the bare trees sway like dancing skeletons against the gray sky. Selu wrapped herself in her bearskin cloak as she walked along the trail now covered with snow, her steps leaving deep marks in the frozen ground that quickly disappeared under the flakes that continued to fall. The meetings with James had become more frequent and intimate, now held in a small cave hidden among the rocks, where they could protect themselves from the cold and from curious eyes of the village. There, surrounded by the warmth of a carefully lit fire and the furs he brought, they shared not only words and gestures, but also silences loaded with meaning that spoke directly to the heart. James had learned to braid small figures with twigs, a skill he had observed among Cherokee artisans, and presented Selu with delicate birds and flowers that she kept like treasures in a leather pouch hidden under her bed. The transformation in Selu did not go unnoticed by her mother's attentive eyes, who noticed how her daughter hummed soft melodies while grinding corn, how her fingers absent-mindedly caressed her lips during household tasks, how her eyes shone with an inner light that had not existed before. Galilahi knew the signs of first love. She herself had felt them decades ago when she met Selu's father, but there was a different quality to this passion, an intensity that worried her deeply. During the long winter nights, when the wind howled around the house like restless spirits, she watched her daughter pretend to sleep while her thoughts clearly flew far away, to a place where a young Cherokee woman should not venture her heart. The conversations between mother and daughter became tense, loaded with unspoken words and concerns that grew like shadows in the corner of the house. Wisa, feeling he was losing ground in the battle for Selu's heart, intensified his efforts to win her attention and her family's approval. He brought increasingly elaborate gifts, furs from rare animals he had hunted in distant mountains, necklaces made with bare teeth that symbolized his courage, and offers of protection that included promises to build her the most beautiful house in the village. His dark eyes filled with despair whenever Selu accepted his gifts with distant politeness, thanking him with formal words that did not carry the warmth he longed to find. During village meetings, when the men sat around the central fire to discuss hunts and tribal matters, Wisa spoke increasingly loudly about the dangers represented by foreigners, about the need to protect Cherokee traditions and maintain the purity of their lineage. His words found echo among the elders, especially among those who had lived through the first expulsions and knew what it meant to trust the white man. The situation reached a critical point during the winter ceremony, when the entire tribe gathered to celebrate resistance against the harshest season and honor the ancestors who had survived previous winters. Selu danced around the sacred fire with the other unmarried women, her graceful movements following the ancestral rhythms that echoed through generations, but her thoughts were distant, with James waiting for her in the hidden cave. When the ceremony ended and families began to disperse to their homes, Weza approached Galilahi and, with the formality required by tradition, officially asked for Selu's hand in marriage. Selu's mother, pressured by social expectations and worried about her daughter's future, gave her preliminary agreement, establishing that the ceremony would take place at the next full moon. The news spread quickly through the village, accompanied by approvals and congratulations, but Selu received the information like a blow that left her breathless. That night, while the village slept under the blanket of snow that continued to fall, Selu remained awake in her bed, feeling the weight of family and tribal expectations pressing on her chest like a stone. She thought of James waiting for her in the cave, probably wondering why she had not appeared, and felt hot tears flow down her cold cheeks. The love she felt for him had grown beyond her ability to control, transforming into a force that threatened to destroy everything she knew and valued in her life. For the first time, she understood that she would have to make a choice that would change her destiny forever. Accept the safe and traditional path that her family had laid out for her, or follow her heart toward an uncertain and potentially dangerous future. The full moon approached like an implacable deadline, and with it, the moment when her decision would become irreversible. The crescent moon cast silver shadows on the snow when Selu finally escaped her family's growing vigilance and ran along the slippery trail toward the cave where James awaited her. Her bare feet left red marks in the snow, but she did not feel the cold that penetrated through her cloak, only the desperate urgency to find the man who had become the center of her world. When she reached the cave, breathless and with hair disheveled by the wind, she found James feeding a small fire, his blue eyes lighting up with relief and concern upon seeing her. He immediately perceived that something had changed, that the sadness she carried was different from the habitual melancholy of their secret meetings. Selu threw herself into his arms with a force that surprised him, and he held her against his chest, feeling her tears moisten his wool shirt, while she trembled not only from cold, but from despair. Through broken words in Cherokee and English, desperate gestures and tears she could not contain, Selu told James about the arranged marriage, about her family's pressure, and about time running out like sand between fingers. James listened in silence, his large, calloused hands gently stroking her hair while processing the magnitude of what was happening. He had sensed this moment would come. Cultures did not mix easily, and love between a white man and a Cherokee woman was seen as betrayal by both sides. But being there, holding Selu while she broke apart in his arms, made him understand that he could not simply accept losing her to a destiny she had not chosen. His own eyes filled with tears when he gently pulled her away to look at her face, seeing in her the same desperate determination he felt, growing in his own chest. The proposal arose between them like a dangerous idea that neither dared to name completely. But that hung in the charged air of the cave like smoke from the fire. James held Selu's hands between his, feeling the delicacy of her fingers contrasting with the strength of her determination, and whispered words that sounded like a prayer and a promise at the same time. He spoke about the lands beyond the mountains, about places where they could start a new life away from the judgments and traditions that separated them, about the possibility of building together something that belonged only to them. Selu listened with her heart beating like war drums, knowing that each of his words took her further from the world she knew, and closer to a future that could be both liberating and destructive. Fear and hope battled in her chest, but when she looked into James's eyes, she saw reflected there the same desperate courage she felt in herself. The decision was made in silence, sealed with a kiss that tasted of tears and promises, of farewells and new beginnings. They planned their escape with the precision of a hunt, choosing the night before the wedding as the moment of their departure, when vigilance would be focused on ceremony preparations and not on their movements. James would bring 2 horses and sufficient supplies for the journey through the mountains, while Selu would discreetly gather her few most precious possessions, some family jewels, warm clothes, and the small leather pouch where she kept the gifts he had given her. They would meet in the clearing beyond the creek, far enough from the village not to be heard, but close enough for Selu to arrive without arousing suspicion. The new moon was approaching, offering them the darkness they would need to disappear like ghosts in the night. When they separated that dawn, both knew they were crossing a line that could not be undone, making a decision that would make them exiles from their own worlds in search of a place where they could exist together. Selu returned to the village with silent steps, slipping into her house like a shadow, while James mounted his horse and disappeared into the darkness toward his cabin, where he spent the rest of the night preparing everything for the journey that would change their lives forever. In the days that followed, she fulfilled her family obligations with a supernatural calm that worried her mother, participating in wedding preparations as if in a trance, her distant eyes fixed on a horizon only she could see. The waning moon approached the end of its cycle, and with it, the moment when Selu would leave behind everything she knew in the name of a love that defied the very world. The night of escape arrived wrapped in heavy clouds that obscured the stars, creating perfect darkness for Selu and James's desperate plans. The village buzzed with final wedding preparations, women finishing the last details of the ceremonial dress embroidered with beads that Selu would never wear, while men organized the ritual hunt that would precede the ceremony. Selu moved through the house like a ghost, silently gathering her few precious belongings, her grandmother's necklace made with sacred stones from the river, some warm clothes carefully folded, and the leather pouch where she kept the small treasures James had given her during their secret meetings. Each object she touched seemed to carry the weight of a final farewell, and she allowed herself a moment of hesitation when holding the wedding dress her mother had embroidered with so much love and hope. Galilahi, restless with nightmares she could not understand, woke in the middle of the night and noticed her daughter's absence from her bed. She rose silently and walked through the dark house, finding Selu standing before the small window, looking toward the mountains invisible in the darkness. Mother and daughter stared at each other for a long moment, and Galilahi saw in Selu's eyes a determination she recognized from her own youth, when she had defied her family to marry the man she loved. Without uttering a word, she understood that her daughter was about to make an irreversible choice, and felt her heart break between the desire to protect her and the recognition that true love sometimes requires sacrifices that defy all reason. Galilahi approached slowly and placed her hands on Selu's shoulders, whispering an ancient blessing in Cherokee that her own mother had whispered to her decades ago. When Selu finally left the house, carrying only a small deerskin bundle, she left behind a letter written in Cherokee symbols that explained her decision and asked for forgiveness, but not regret. The walk to the clearing where James awaited her seemed to last an eternity, each step taking her further from everything she knew and closer to an uncertain future. The sound of hooves against the frozen earth announced his presence before she could see him in the darkness, and when he dismounted and ran toward her, she threw herself into his arms with the force of one who throws herself from a cliff hoping to fly. James held her against his chest, feeling the tremor of fear and determination that ran through her body, and whispered words of love and promises of protection that were lost in the cold night wind. The ride through the mountains was a journey through the unknown, with Selu mounted on the second horse James had brought, following him along narrow trails that serpentined between snow-covered rocks and trees that rose like silent sentinels. The cold cut their faces like blades, but they continued advancing, driven by the urgent need to put distance between them and the village that would certainly discover their escape at dawn. Selu looked back only once, seeing the distant lights of her homeland disappear behind a mountain curve, and felt something break in her chest, not regret, but the inevitable pain of leaving behind a part of herself she could never recover. James rode ahead of her like a guide through a new world, his broad shoulders cutting the wind as he led them toward a land where they could try to build a life together. Dawn found them exhausted and frozen, hidden in a small cave in the high mountains, where they lit a fire to warm themselves and shared water and dried meat James had brought in his baggage. Selu nestled against his chest, listening to the constant rhythm of his heart that had become the only familiar sound in a completely strange world, and for the first time since making her decision, allowed herself to imagine what her life would be like from then on. They still had days of travel ahead before reaching the lands where James planned to build their new home. Days when they would need to hide from search parties that would certainly be sent after them. Days when they would learn to survive together in a world that belonged neither to him nor to her, but that they would have to make theirs through the strength of their love and determination. 3 years passed like leaves carried by the wind, and the small cabin James had built in the wilderness beyond the mountains had transformed into a true home, surrounded by a garden where Selu cultivated corn, beans, and squash according to the ancestral methods her grandmother had taught her. The house, made of hand-cut logs and mud mixed with straw, stood in a clearing protected by tall pines near a crystal-clear creek that sang day and night like a lullaby. Selu had learned to live in this world between two worlds, adapting her Cherokee traditions to the needs of her new life, while James absorbed her knowledge of medicinal plants and wilderness survival techniques. They had created their own language made of words in Cherokee and English, silent gestures and looks that said more than any conversation, living in harmony with nature's cycles and with the love that had grown even stronger through shared hardships. The baby arrived with spring, a girl with dark hair and eyes that changed color like the evening sky, carrying in her delicate face the characteristics of both parents mixed in a unique beauty. Selu held her against her chest for the first time, with tears of joy streaming down her cheeks, feeling a completeness she didn't know she had been searching for, while James caressed their daughter's tiny fingers with a tenderness that transformed his calloused hands into instruments of absolute protection. They called her Atsadi, which meant fish in Cherokee, because she moved with the same graceful fluidity as the trout that danced in the creek near the house. During the child's first months of life, the cabin filled with deep peace, with Selu singing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, while James created small carved wooden toys that he hung over the improvised cradle. But the perfect happiness of their small world was interrupted by a reality they could no longer ignore. Atsadi needed other children, a community, a place where she could grow up knowing her roots and building her own identity. Selu spent hours watching her daughter play alone in the clearing, creating imaginary friends among the flowers and talking to birds in a mixture of Cherokee and English that sounded like poetry, and felt her heart tighten with the understanding that the love they had built, however perfect, was not enough to give the child everything she needed. James also noticed Selu's growing melancholy, the way she looked toward the distant mountains during sunsets, and knew that a part of her would always be connected to the village she had left behind. They talked about this in whispers during the nights, after Atsadi fell asleep, weighing the fear of rejection against the need to offer their daughter a chance to know her Cherokee heritage. The decision matured slowly, like fruit on a branch, until it became inevitable. They would return to the village, not as fugitives seeking forgiveness, but as a family asking for acceptance. Selu knew she would face her tribe's anger, judgment for having abandoned their traditions, and the possibility of being rejected forever. But she also knew that Atsadi deserved the chance to know her grandmother, to learn the sacred dances, and to grow up knowing where she came from. James understood he would be seen as the white man who had stolen a daughter from the tribe, but was willing to face any hostility if it meant his family could find a place in the world where they belonged. They spent weeks preparing for their return journey, James selling his tools and equipment to traders passing through the region, while Selu sewed traditional Cherokee clothes for herself and Atsadi, using techniques she had practiced in secret during their years of exile. The last night in the cabin was dedicated to memories, with Selu and James walking through the property they had transformed into home, touching each tree he had planted, each stone in the garden she had arranged, engraving in memory the details of a place that represented the first time in their lives they had been completely free to love. Atsadi slept peacefully in her cradle, oblivious to the magnitude of the journey that would begin the next day, while her parents prepared to face a world that might reject them, but that could also, perhaps, find space for the love they had created. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that had witnessed their happiness as they prepared to leave the paradise they had built in search of something even more precious, a future where their daughter could grow up knowing all parts of herself. The journey back to the Cherokee Mountains took 5 days through trails that Selu vaguely recognized, but that had changed during the 3 years of her absence. Fallen trees blocked old paths, new streams had formed with rains and landslides, and signs of growing white settler presence marked the landscape with fences and cleared areas. James rode ahead, carrying supplies and staying alert for any sign of danger, while Selu followed close behind, with Atsadi tied against her chest in a traditional Cherokee blanket she had woven during long winter nights. The 2-year-old child observed everything with curious and attentive eyes, pointing at birds and squirrels with small chubby fingers, not understanding that they were heading toward an encounter that could change their lives forever. The weight of anticipation grew with each mile traveled, and Selu felt her stomach contract whenever she recognized a familiar rock formation or river bend that indicated their proximity to her birthplace. When they finally spotted the smoke from Cherokee village fires rising in straight columns against the blue late afternoon sky, Selu felt her legs tremble and had to hold onto the saddle to keep from falling off her horse. The village seemed smaller than she remembered, but the familiar structures were all there. The assembly house with its carefully thatched roof, family dwellings scattered in a semicircle around the central square, and the sacred place where ceremonies took place, marked by stones arranged in ancestral patterns. James dismounted first and helped Selu down from her horse, holding Atsadi while she rearranged her traditional clothes and breathed deeply to find courage. The child looked around with fascination, as if instinctively sensing that this place was different from any other she had known, her small hands reaching toward the familiar trees that had witnessed her mother's birth. The first person to notice them was a child playing at the creek's edge, who dropped her stick toys and ran screaming toward the village, her shrill voices echoing among the trees like alarms. Within minutes, figures emerged from houses and grouped in the central square, their faces showing a mixture of shock, curiosity, and distrust. Selu recognized many of them, cousins, aunts, childhood friends who had aged during her absence, but it was her mother's figure, Galilahi, that made her break into tears. The older woman had grayed in the 3 years that had passed, her face marked by lines that spoke of worry and loss, but her eyes still carried the same wisdom and strength Selu remembered. Mother and daughter looked at each other across the distance of the square, and in that moment, all the pain of separation, all the repressed longing, and all the love that had remained untouched by time materialized in the air between them like an invisible bridge. Weser emerged from the forming crowd, now older and hardened by years, his eyes narrowing when he saw James beside Selu, but then softening when he noticed the child in her arms. He had married during Selu's absence. She could see this in the matrimonial necklace he wore, and in the way a young woman approached him possessively, but there was still in his eyes a flicker of old pain, of rejection that had never been completely healed. The village chief, NVHI, stepped forward with the solemn dignity of one who carries the responsibility of making difficult decisions, his hair completely white now, but his posture still erect and proud. He observed the small group with eyes that had seen many seasons of change, evaluating not only Selu and James, but also the child who represented something new and unexplored for the tribe. Silence stretched for long moments, loaded with tension and expectation, while the entire village awaited the first words that would determine if the fugitives would be received as lost family or rejected as traitors. Selu took a step forward, holding Atsadi against her chest, and began to speak in Cherokee with a voice that trembled but did not waver, her words echoing across the square like a confession and a plea at the same time. She told about the years she had spent away, about the love she had found and the family she had created, but mainly about the desire for her daughter to know the traditions and wisdom of her people. James remained silent beside her, understanding by the tone of her voice and gestures that she was opening her heart to the tribe, offering her vulnerability as proof of her sincerity. Atsadi observed the unknown faces around with growing curiosity, babbling a mixture of sounds in Cherokee and English that drew involuntary smiles from some of the older women, who recognized in the child's movements the graceful gestures characteristic of her lineage. Galilahi was the first to break the circle of tension, moving toward her daughter with steps that began hesitant but became more determined with each meter traveled. When mother and daughter finally embraced, a collective sigh seemed to escape from the gathered crowd, as if the entire village had been holding its breath during the 3 years of Selu's absence. The embrace lasted long minutes, with both women crying silently, their tears mixing decades of love, loss, forgiveness, and reunion in a moment that transcended words. When they finally separated, Galilahi extended her hands toward the granddaughter she had never known, and Atsadi, with the natural intuition of small children, leaned toward her grandmother with a smile that illuminated her entire face. The elder held the child with hands trembling with emotion, whispering prayers of gratitude in Cherokee, while studying every feature of the small face, looking for echoes of her own lineage mixed with unknown characteristics that told the story of a love that had defied worlds. NVHI observed this first moment of family reconnection with the wisdom of one who had led the tribe through many crises and changes, understanding that the question before him was more complex than simply punishing a daughter who had disobeyed traditions. The child changed everything. She was Cherokee as much as she was something more, and represented a new reality that the tribe would have to learn to accept or reject. He approached slowly, his eyes studying James with the intensity of one who evaluates a potential enemy, but also with the curiosity of one who recognizes that the world was changing in ways that demanded new forms of wisdom. James sustained the chief's gaze without challenge or subservience, offering respect without renouncing his own dignity, and something in this delicate balance seemed to impress the older man. When NVHI finally spoke, it was to convene a council of elders that would meet the next morning to decide the fate of the family that had returned. The night that followed was charged with whispered conversations in all the village houses, with divided opinions spreading like waves in a disturbed lake. Some of the older women defended Selu, arguing that maternal love was a sacred force that should be respected, and that the child deserved to know her Cherokee roots, regardless of the circumstances of her conception. Others, led by some of the younger warriors, expressed concern about the precedent that would be established if a woman could abandon the tribe, marry outside her culture, and return expecting acceptance. Weser remained notably silent during these discussions, his own wife watching him with growing unease as he struggled with complex feelings that included old pain, curiosity about the path not taken, and a strange form of respect for the courage Selu had demonstrated in following her heart. Selu spent the night in her mother's house, where she had grown up, but which now seemed simultaneously familiar and strange, like a place visited in dreams. Atsadi fell asleep easily in the bed that had been Selu's as a child, lulled by the lullabies Galilahi sang with a voice choked with emotion, while James was accommodated in the guest house traditionally reserved for visitors from other tribes. The temporary separation of the family served to remind everyone how complicated the situation was. They were not exactly strangers, but they were also no longer completely Cherokee. During the silent hours before dawn, Selu remained awake beside her sleeping daughter, stroking the child's dark hair and whispering prayers in Cherokee to the ancestors, asking for guidance and protection for the family that had risked everything in the name of love. James, alone in the guest house, listened to the village's night sounds, the crackling of distant fires, the murmur of conversations in nearby houses, the occasional howling of coyotes in the mountains, and reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he was just a lonely blacksmith building a simple life on the frontier. Now he was the father of a Cherokee child and husband of a woman whose courage had changed both their lives forever. He thought of Selu and Atsadi sleeping in the nearby house and felt an iron determination solidify in his chest. Regardless of the council's decision the next day, he would protect his family and fight for their right to remain together. Love had brought them this far, and love would sustain them through any storm that might come. The Council of Elders met with the first ray of sun, forming a solemn circle in the assembly house while the entire village congregated outside, their low voices creating a constant murmur of expectation and anxiety. Selu sat in the center of the circle with Atsadi in her lap, wearing the finest of her traditional Cherokee dresses, her hands intertwined with her daughter's, while awaiting the verdict that would determine if they could remain or if they would have to depart again into exile. James waited outside with the other village members, his eyes fixed on the assembly house entrance, preparing to accept any decision, but also ready to protect his family if necessary. NVHI began the ceremony with ancestral prayers that asked wisdom from the spirits of the ancestors, his grave voice echoing through the wooden walls as he invoked the guidance necessary to make a decision that would affect not only Selu and her family, but the tribe's future itself. One by one, the elders spoke about their concerns and considerations, their voices carrying the weight of decades of experience and responsibility for preserving Cherokee traditions. Some expressed fear that accepting Selu and her mixed family might encourage other young women to abandon their tribal obligations, while others argued that excessive rigidity could lead to the loss of precious children from the tribe. Throughout the debate, Atsadi remained surprisingly quiet and attentive, as if instinctively understanding the importance of the moment, her dark eyes moving from one face to another, as if studying each person who decided her fate. When one of the most respected elders, Unaduti, rose to speak, a respectful silence fell over the assembly, for her word carried the weight of 8 decades of wisdom, and her reputation for justice was known throughout the region. Unaduti spoke with the clear and firm voice of one who had lived through many changes and survived numerous crises, reminding the council that the Cherokee tribe's strength had always resided in its capacity to adapt without losing its essence. She looked directly at Atsadi while speaking, seeing in the child not just the product of a controversial union, but a link between 2 worlds that the tribe would have to learn to navigate in the coming decades. Her words echoed through the assembly house like a prophecy and a blessing, as she argued that rejecting the child would be rejecting a part of the Cherokee future, and that accepting the family would demonstrate true ancestral strength and wisdom. When she finished speaking, a profound silence fell over the assembly, each person present processing the magnitude of her words and considering the implications of her proposal. The final decision came after hours of deliberation, with NVHI rising slowly and walking to where Selu waited with her daughter, his ancient eyes reflecting a mixture of authority and compassion that defined his leadership. He knelt before Atsadi, studying the child's face for long moments, before extending one of his hands toward her. whispering words in Cherokee that sounded like a blessing and recognition. The child, without hesitation, extended her own little hand and touched the wrinkled face of the chief, drawing from him a smile that transformed his entire expression. When NVHI rose and announced that Selu and her family would be accepted back into the tribe, conditional on James's commitment to respect and learn Cherokee traditions, a collective sigh of relief and joy escaped the assembly like wind through pines. The entire village erupted in celebration, with women running to embrace Selu and men approaching James with gestures of cautious but genuine acceptance. Galilahi held her granddaughter with tears of joy streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, whispering promises to teach her all the songs, stories, and traditions a Cherokee child should know. James was led by the village men toward the river, where he participated in a purification ceremony that symbolized his provisional acceptance into the community, his white man's clothes being replaced by Cherokee garments that marked his new status as a tribe member. When the sun set on that transformative day, Selu and James met at the edge of the same creek where they had first encountered each other 4 years ago. Now no longer as fugitive lovers, but as a family accepted by a community that had found space in its heart for a love that transcended cultural boundaries. Atsadi played in the shallow water between them, her childish laughter echoing through the valley, like a promise that the future would be built on the solid foundation of love, acceptance, and mutual understanding they had conquered through their courage and determination. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.